Hello and welcome to Payments Unfiltered. With me today, I have Galit Shani-Michel, who is the VP of Payments at Forta. She has over 15 years experience, including being a member of the MRC. She is a true expert in fraud prevention. Today, we'll be diving into how fraud has evolved over the last decade, how you need to think about the entire customer journey to combat fraud, and how the latest tools are reshaping the industry. Let's jump straight into the conversation. To kick off, I thought we could start with a very high-level question. What does payment fraud mean to you?
Cool. So I actually started my career many years ago, almost 20, a lot, doing fraud. And in the beginning, you always think like, fraud is about like stopping fraudsters from, 20 years ago, it was mainly about stolen cards and people stealing like databases and stuff. And I thought fraud is about stopping the fraudsters. And very fast you realize it's about more than that. It's about all the good people that you mistakenly think they are fraudsters, and you're starting to stop them. And a lot of times these are your best consumers trying to purchase for very high amounts. And I think that was like when you realize, okay, it's actually not about the fraudsters. Yes, you have to keep them out, but it's about the good customers, that you don't want to harm them, that you don't want them to think that you think falsely that they are fraudsters, that you don't want to make their life difficult. And I think this is where it's really comes into payment, because these good consumers, you want to give them a good customer experience, and you also don't want anybody else to think they're fraudsters. So for me, that was when I realized like that's the connection between managing fraud and managing payment, because hey, these issuers, they're declining them because they also think they're fraud. Or this PSP are blocking them, like turning 3DS on because they think they are risky. So this is when you realize actually everything is about fraud. Like when it gets down to like fraud.
Okay, that's amazing. All right, so further things about fraud, there's different types of fraud. So we have what people call first-party fraud and third-party fraud. Could you maybe give us your view on the difference between them? I know we've previously discussed about the term friendly fraud. So could you maybe do an intro into those as topics? And equally, what do you think merchants should be thinking about when they consider those two types of fraud?
Sure. So first-party fraud, often also referred to as friendly fraud. Sometimes it's called own PM. It took me a while to understand like using their own payment method. This kind of fraud is actually when someone is using their own card. So I go to a website, I buy with my own card, some sneakers, and then I reach my bank and I say, hey, I don't know what it is. I didn't do it. And this is often called like friendly fraud or first-party fraud. The other kind is actually when someone else used my card. So I woke up in the morning and I realized that someone bought something, some sneakers, whatever, with my card. I don't know who that is. I've never done that in my life. I was never in that website before. And this is what is referred to as like real fraud. So someone committed fraud. Someone said he's me, used my card, and bought something, which obviously I never got because they took it for themselves.
And so how should merchants be reasoning about those two types of fraud? What are the approaches or levers that they have to mitigate the costs to them?
Cool. So maybe we start with like the real fraud. And when we think about real fraud, think about it. Someone is coming to a website claiming they are Galit and they are trying to do something, but they are not me. They will do everything to look like me. They will dress like me. They will try to sound like me. They will have an IP from like where I'm coming from. And the challenge here is to realize that they are not who they say they are, and that they are not using their own, or they are who they say they are, but they are using a card which does not belong to them, or a payment method which does not belong to them. And this is where it gets very, very difficult now, because using AI today is very accessible and it's very easy for anyone to look like someone else, to create a fake identity, a lot of details are out there in the dark web everywhere. So it's easier than in the past to find the data that you need to do it. And it's easier in terms of technology to look like someone that you're not. So kind of like to hide behind an identity that you're not is becoming super difficult. And if almost 20 years ago when I managed fraud, I created rules. So every morning I woke up, I had 20 people in my department coming in. They saw whatever the system would tag for them to look at. They would block it. And my responsibility was to keep creating rules for them. So, hey, the IP and the bin do not match, and the country and the amount is high, and this person is from this country, using an email ending with whatever. All this logic, I thought I was very smart. I kept coming up with like very, very interesting things. And I saw the chargebacks and I reacted. I created more rules. These rules basically, they were always fraudsters managing to get through. So you always create the rule after the fraud comes. And then there are some good people that are actually blocked by these rules because maybe they're not fraudsters. They are just happen to be in that country, to use the credit card not from their own country. And when you are traveling, that happens a lot to you. So you're in a hotel, you try to order something to the hotel. Obviously, I'm not American. Obviously, my card is not American, but I'm still staying at the hotel and I need something. So even in the past, the rules approach was never that great because some fraud go through and a lot of good people are being blocked by these rules. And then you have to go back and try to start to remove some of the rules, but that's very difficult. And today it's even harder because using AI, it's very simple to understand your rules. So any fraudster can just like walk around your rule, find the way, understand, okay, they see my red hat, they don't like it. Okay, I will not wear my red hat, I'll just come through. So today it's very, very, very difficult to use rules to stop fraud. And I think most of the industry is moving into AI and machine learning and more advanced technology. And the key here is to really understand identity. It's not about exactly what you do always. Maybe you buy for a lot of money. It's not about that. It's like, who are you? How can we really understand that this is Theo trying to purchase something and it's not someone pretending to be you? So the key here today is identity with real fraud.
And would you say like AI is the biggest change you've seen in like the last 10, 15 years in fraud, and both from the sophistication of the fraudster, but equally the capabilities that you have to combat that fraud?
Yes, so I would say both the AI, which is becoming, the technology is just becoming really better. So it's better for merchant and better for fraud prevention companies. They can use it to do much better job, but it's also better for the fraudsters. So we kind of call it, you need to be ahead of the game because the fraudsters are ahead of the game. So if there is a technology out there, you're not using it, they're using it. Well, obviously they're going to win. It's always about who is better, who is doing a better job. If they are doing a better job, they will find a way. So this is one. And the other one is, I think, data is so much more accessible today. So it's not new, but in the dark web, in different places, it's becoming extremely easy to purchase database of cards, to purchase persona details. I think in the past it was harder. There were also ways to do it, but it was harder. And right now, the data is out there. It's not really, really secure as we would, let's say, like it to be, or work to make it really secure with PCI and all the other technology, but it's really out there. So I think the data is more accessible and the technology obviously make it very, very easy to pretend.
And so that's really interesting. So AI, sophistication of the fraudsters, easy accessible to data. They've got all these tools that they can spin up, like kind of fraudulent kind of collateral or information. But then on the merchant side, they need to collect more data and they need to build this AI. So it sounds like actually the AI rise is helping fraudsters maybe more than a merchant by themselves, because they would need to hire data analysts, machine learning scientists. They need to build this like huge data set. So actually, is it possible for a merchant now to combat this wave of new fraudsters powered by AI by themselves? And if they do, is it just like incredibly expensive versus 15 years ago where you could just define these like hard-coded conditional if-else statements. If IP is this, block.
I think it is so much more expensive. And more than that, because it's more complicated, maybe the third trend idea mentioned before is about data sharing. So how can you fight fraud together? So this behavior, these fraudsters already tried to do something, not on your site. Or if we take it the other way around, here is a good consumer. He's coming to your website for the first time. You don't know them. So you're not really sure about them. With the best technology ever, you just are not sure about them because it's the first time you are seeing them. But it's not the first time they are buying online. So they bought from another website yesterday or last week. And the question is, how do you leverage that? So someone else knows them. And this is, I think, the power of the good fraud prevention companies that are out there. They use the power of the network. So if you use a fraud prevention company that has a lot of data and that know a lot of identity, and the question is how many identities or what percentage of the population you know in each country, depends on where that fraud prevention company is working. If a company who knows 98 or 99% of the population in the UK, for example, the chances is almost everybody that will come buy from you is not new. So if you use someone else to tell you, hey, don't worry about Galit, she's always doing that in the middle of the night, just buying all these flight tickets because that's the time that she's buying her travel for the family, then you don't have to worry about me. And I think this is also what is changing today. You need that power of the network. You can't fight fraud alone anymore. And when we talk to merchants today, I talk to a lot of merchants, they realize that. They realize they can't and they should not be fighting fraud alone.
That's interesting. So community approach is not a nice to have anymore. It's
Right.
kind of becoming the requirement. You're a part of the MRC, which is also a community around trying to help merchants kind of reason and think about tackling risk. Could you maybe share with everyone what the MRC is and how you think that can bring value to merchants to kind of leverage this community approach that you just explained?
Yeah, so the MRC is the Merchant Risk Council. It's a community that deals with payment and fraud. It's a community of merchants at the end of the day. And the MRC does three things. So one of them is the connections and the ecosystem, basically. So merchant can meet a lot of other merchants. They can meet in conferences. They can meet in many different there is like a Slack channel, there is WhatsApp channel, there are communities on the website, there are community calls every few weeks. There is a payment community call, a fraud community call, issuer community call. So you can register to any community that you want and you can get a lot of insights into what's happening. So you see something you are not familiar with that is happening, you don't understand it, you go to the community, someone else is also seeing this. Now there is like ton of talks about the new fraud programs by Visa, for example. What is going to be? How is it going to look? What does that mean for me? A lot of discussion was like around the 8-digit BIN. How do we even work with it? What are we doing? So it's things that it's very, very hard. Payment becoming really complicated. Being in this industry for many years, it's very complicated and it's very deep. There are a lot of payment methods, a lot of things that are happening. Trying to understand everything on your own. There is tons of data out there that is very hard to understand, like what's really going on. So one thing the MRC is really great at is the community. So you can find more merchants, more people that are actually having the same challenges as you, and you can understand how they are tackling it, how they are thinking about it. This is one. The other one is education. So it is complicated. Tons of webinars, conferences, sessions at the conferences, talks that you can actually educate yourself and learn, because I think being a payment and fraud person, you have to keep learning every day. You can't just sit there. It's running so fast, like it's happening so fast. So it's education. And the last thing that the MRC is really great at is actually advocating for merchants. So PSD3, for example, is coming. a lot of things that were there do not make a lot of sense for merchants. Sometimes it's not clear. Some of it is going to be very difficult for merchant. Not always these regulators understand merchant. I say not always, but most of the time they don't. Someone needs to go there and advocate for the merchant. Japan regulation is another example. You're asking for all these things. What does that mean for merchants? In the beginning, Japan, they wanted to apply 3DS always on every transaction without any exemption, without anything. That's going to hurt merchants a lot. So the MRC that's the third activity that is done by the MRC, they are doing a lot of these activities with the advocacy. And then they publish it. So merchant can see, okay, this is how the regulation is going to look like. This is how I should think about it. PSD3 has been for 3 years. Everybody's like, are you ready for PSD3? And I think by now still nobody really understands what that means. So I think this is another way to really enjoy the community. The community of the merchant out there is amazing. There are so many experts, and I love to go to these conferences and learn and go into the sessions and meet a lot of people. Sometimes one coffee that I will have with someone that I can even just pick up the phone and call them when I run into something like, hey, I remember you have this challenge as well. What are you finding? I think that helps us be better at our job at the end of the day.
Awesome. So don't fight fraud alone. And then MRC sounds like a great community. You mentioned 3DS. I'd love to touch on that. So what role do you see 3DS having in fraud prevention?
This is a great question. So I will say first what it's not. It's not a fraud tool. And the reason I say it is 3DS, the heart of the 3DS is that it shifts the liability to the bank from the merchant. So if there was a fraud and the transaction had 3DS and I call the bank and I say, hey, I didn't do this transaction, there is another question of how did the 3DS pass, but it can sometimes. And I say I didn't do this transaction. Now the liability on this money that the bank is giving me is on the bank, on my issuer. The merchant is not losing any money if the transaction was with 3DS. In most of the codes, gambling, there are some exceptions, but normally the liability will shift. A lot of merchants thought that, hey, this is great. I don't need the fraud tool anymore. I'll just apply 3DS. If it's fraud, probably they will not pass the 3DS. If they are good, they will pass the 3DS challenge. And the challenge still in most of the cases, it's an SMS. So you get the SMS, you have the code, you have to type the code. Sometimes you will have an app. In the more digital banks now, it goes into apps. A lot of the countries like Sweden, Denmark, it's more and more apps. But in most of the countries, it's still an SMS. So people thought, okay, merchants thought like we can do 3DS and we don't have to worry about fraud anymore. It's not a fraud tool. When you send a lot of fraud to 3DS, the chargeback itself is still counted toward your fraud to sale ratios. And this means that if a lot of fraud passes 3DS, you run into the programs. You're not liable for the chargeback itself, but you're still in the programs. You will still pay the fines. And if worst come to worst, you will lose your merchant account. So sending fraud to 3DS is really bad. It also will harm your auth rate because the bank will see that this is what you're doing and nobody will like you anymore. So it's not a fraud rate. It's not a fraud tool. The other challenge with it is the assumption that if you're a valid person, it's not so hard. Find the SMS, type the code. Come on, everybody can do it. Success rate should be 100% for the good consumers. That's a misconception. And recently I proved to a UK merchant that even in the UK, sending every transaction to 3DS, just in the UK, cost 5% conversion, bottom line revenue, unique. 5%. So if you can do exemption, let's say on 85% of the transaction because of like lower amounts, doing that versus sending everything to 3DS will cost you in the UK 5% bottom line revenue. And there are various reasons to it, but I always like to give my mom as an example. She's 71. She just had her birthday last week. And by the time she finds her phone, she buys online. By the time she finds her phone, she realizes there is an SMS. She finds the SMS. She has to go back to the website. She has to type it. If it's in her phone, she doesn't even know how to go back and forth between the website and the SMS. She will get a timeout. If she gets a timeout, she can't buy. If she can't buy, she will never use the website again. So you just lost a really good consumer that is literally not fraud. And when you lose it it's also a bad customer experience. She's going to choose a website where she doesn't get the SMS. SMSs sometimes do not arrive. There is phone reception issue. They arrive late. I was traveling. I tried to buy something. The SMS never arrived. I just couldn't buy. I just wanted to book tickets to a museum. I was traveling. I had 1 hour free. I wanted to go to the museum. The SMS never arrived. I just could not book it. It's not that I don't know what to do. Every time it arrived after 5 minutes. So I couldn't buy it. So good consumers will not always pass the 3DS. And sometimes they're just upset. You're traveling, you want it fast, you want it convenient, and now the 3DS thing come and you're like, what is this? Like, it's so complicated. And you will go buy somewhere else. So you don't want the good consumers to have the 3DS experience. That is the other reason it's not a fraud tool and it's not something to just ask everybody to do.
So that's the bearish case on 3DS.
Yeah.
Is there a bullish side of 3DS that you like where it does bring value?
Yes. So the good thing with 3DS to do, if we are still talking about the real fraudsters, and we'll talk about the friendly, not so friendly fraud in a minute, the only thing you can do with 3DS that really makes a lot of sense, two things actually. One is there is regulation. Obviously, we have PSD2. Japan in 2 months will have the Japan new 3DS regulation. Some other countries will go with 3DS. Sometimes you need to do 3DS because that's what the regulation wants you to do. Sometimes because of the regulation, for example, in Europe, some issuers will prefer 3DS. So maybe it is allowed to avoid 3DS, but this issuer in Sweden have like a very, very low auth rate without 3DS. So you want to do 3DS to make the issuer happy and authorize the transaction. But the most important thing for 3DS, use it on your borderline traffic. That's what we call it. So like the more risky transaction, not the fraud. Like the fraud needs to stay out. You have to decline it. It needs to go out. You're not trying to fool around with a bank. It's not a game. Fraud needs to stay out and we all need to fight it together. So the fraud is out, but you have borderline. You have this 2%, maybe 3% you're not sure about. You want to ask them for additional authentication. You want them to prove that they are who they say they are. It's like someone asks you a question. You don't know. You don't have enough information. You ask more questions. So for me, 3DS is like, okay, I want to ask you a few more questions before I decide if I want you or not. So you send your borderline to 3DS. And this way, instead of, let's say, declining 5% of your population, you decline 2.5. 2.5 you would send to 3DS. If they pass 3DS, it means they are good. If some fraud went through, it's still very, very small and you will not run into any problem. So that's like the most interesting thing to do, I think, with 3DS.
And do you see, you mentioned Japan. Are you starting to see like 3DS increasing globally? Because obviously it was a very European heavy thing, and then Japan's coming, and I know there's Brazil keen on, some issuers there are keen on 3DS as well. But in the US, if you try and challenge 3DS, it's not going to have good auth rates. So do you think that 3DS popularity will grow globally? And if not, like, what are the other regional differences that you see when trying to kind of combat payment fraud?
So I think 3DS is growing. Europe is always kind of leading the way in payments. And the US is a few years behind in a funny way. So I'll talk about the US in a second when we talk about friendly fraud. I think that we see it in Japan. There are a lot of talks about like the regulation will come also to other countries. It's just a matter of time. Australia, they had something in place. Now it looks like there is a delay. So there is anything concrete, but Australia will also come. Some countries like Indonesia, some countries in APAC are also going to apply 3DS. And I think it's a tool that is out there. So the issuer India also, we are seeing they prefer 3DS a lot of the times. So it's starting to get more popular. I think it will grow. And hopefully mainly what I hope is that the technology will get better. So when it's going to be an app, when it's going to be very easy, instead of SMSs, everything related to even like face, like everything, when the authentication will become easier, that's when 3DS will become a better process than trying to find your SMS, being reliant on like the phone company for the SMS. So I think 3DS will become bigger. It's a matter of time. When it comes to the US consumers are not very used to the challenge. A lot of times they will not cooperate with it. A lot of times the SMS is not coming so fast, but also like they see it and a lot of times they will not cooperate with it, even if they're good consumers. On the other hand, in the US, a lot of the 3DS is frictionless at the moment. About 65% of the US 3DS is frictionless. Frictionless means that as a consumer, you don't have to do anything. Sometimes you don't see anything. Sometimes you will see this like rolling around and that's it. And you're not required to really do it. It will authenticate all the data without asking you to do anything. So maybe we can move to the friendly fraud piece. So we said friendly fraud is real consumers. So this would be me buying something and then saying I didn't buy it. Nothing friendly about it. Sometimes if they would contact the merchant could remind them, hey, but we sent you this and this, like how come you say you didn't get it? So sometimes maybe they really are not sure what they bought. They don't understand the descriptor. Their kid bought it with their card, things like this. It's still considered friendly fraud. But sometimes it's just liars. And these buyer liars, how we also like to call them, they're a really big problem. They are becoming a really big problem because they are basically lying, saying they didn't do it. And all the fraud tools out there, it's very hard to catch them because I'm saying I'm Galit, I'm buying with my card, I'm buying for €500 some sneakers. How can someone know that I'm going to lie later on about not buying it? And even if you try to share data, as we said before, the fact that I said I didn't buy it doesn't mean that every website now needs to block me. Maybe really that time I didn't buy it, like my kid took my card, I didn't know, and they did something with it. Like you can't say everybody that said once they didn't buy something, like everybody should ban them from their websites anymore. So it's a very big challenge. So the normal fraud detection tools, it makes it very, very difficult because they are them. It's very difficult to block them. And then one of the really great ways to deal with them, two ways to deal with them, I would say. One is to apply 3DS when it can be frictionless, and especially in the US, when it can be frictionless and when the banks actually are happy with 3DS. So if you can find the transactions that the bank auth rate will be good, because the US banks sometimes they don't really like to take the liability. But a lot of times they're okay with it, especially if they start to see a lot of good traffic coming in. Their auth rate will become good because they realize you just send good traffic. So you send good traffic to 3DS for banks that can give you a frictionless experience and the auth rate is good, and you can shift up to 40 to even 45% of the liability to the bank. And why I like it is I think it really fixes this problem, because when I call the bank and I say, hey, I didn't do this, I didn't buy this pair of shoes for €500, no 3DS normally means the bank will say, depends on the country and the issuer, so I don't want to sound like really bullish here on the issuers, but normally my issuer will say, are you sure you didn't buy it? Okay, sign here, fine, take your €500. And now the merchant lost €500. But when it's 3DS transaction, I call the bank and the bank sees that they are going to lose the €500. They are just making more effort now. And they're like, are you sure you didn't buy it? Because we see there was a 3DS. It's like shoes from this website at this date, and they try to help me understand. And they a lot of time push back on the consumer trying to do a chargeback. And we see so much less chargebacks. And even for the chargebacks that come in, the merchant is not liable. And we've seen merchants that their chargebacks from friendly fraud came down to 50% by leveraging properly 3DS in the US without harming their conversion. So that was a merchant that said, I don't want my conversion to be harmed, not even a 1 beep, nothing. Like my conversion is top priority for me. Most merchants would say that. But I have a friendly fraud problem. And a lot of like the travel industry, OTAs, they suffer a lot from it. Flight ticket, people are like lying all over the place. And their friendly fraud chargeback went down 50% just by leveraging properly 3DS. So that's one solution. And the other solution would be to have a really good dispute system in place. Some merchants are trying to dispute by themselves. There are a lot of companies out there that can help you with dispute. It can be their fraud vendor. It can be someone else. It's really important to have a good dispute system in place and to be able to prove to the bank that this person is actually lying. So here, we send him the shoes. He got the shoes on this date. Like he's really lying. We know it's him. Here is all the proof that it's him. And this way, the part which was not 3DS, you can still fight it. And if you get everything right, you will get the money back. So this way, you really can reduce your loss from these liar buyers. And I will say one more thing about them, because fraudsters and liars and all the bad people, they will come in anywhere you left, not even the door open, but the window open. You left the window open, they will find it, they will come in. So if it's very hard to charge back, or you fight a chargeback, they will find another way to kind of abuse you. They can call and say they never got the shoes. They can call and say, when I got the package with this cream, for example, it was broken, it was open, please send me a new one. They will say they don't like it and they return it, but they return stones instead of returning what they actually bought. So now you're dealing with a lot of different ways that they can harm you, harm your business, basically. And if you're really good with the checkout process and with chargebacks, you need to get really good at return abuse and anything about item not received, anything that happened basically the post-purchase. So you have seen merchants dealing really well with checkout flows. They don't deal really well with post-purchase issues. So they lose money on the post-purchase issues. So you have to kind of look all over the place. You have to look on the whole flow from registration to account login, checkout, post-purchase, and make sure you protect all of your flow against fraudsters and against the liar buyers. I think this is also a trend we are seeing in the past few years.
Amazing. Buyer liars. I've not heard that before, and I'm 100% going to use that again. Galit, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. It's been great speaking.
Thank you. That's
a wrap for this episode of Payments Unfiltered. Thanks so much to Galit for sharing all of her amazing insights. Please subscribe to this podcast and share with your network, and we'll see you on the next episode of Payments Unfiltered.